There we go. All right.
There we go.
Okay, so welcome everybody to Unorthodox Jewish Beliefs. This is a special 8-part series in what I call Unorthodox Jewish Beliefs. Although I'm going to base a lot of what I say on some traditional sources, some of it is more based on modern Jewish thinkers since the last 200 years, mostly more recent than that. Um, So just by way of background, in general, religion has had to deal with the advances in science and our understanding of the universe that science has discovered in the last 200 years, particularly. But this problem of religion and science really goes back several hundred years. Galileo is sort of the poster child for this issue. As many of you may know, Galileo used a telescope to see the moons of Jupiter. I'm not an astronomer and I don't really understand this exactly, but based on his observation of the moons of Jupiter, he was able to prove that an earlier theory, I think it was Copernicus, that the sun is actually the center of our solar system was true. And the Earth was not the center of the universe. So for centuries and centuries, the Catholic Church in particular, but other religions as well, had argued that the Earth is the center of the universe, and it was, a fundamental principle of faith. And so Galileo, arguing that that's not the case, that the sun is the center of our solar system, he for his all his hard work, he was rewarded by the church by being excommunicated. And so that's kind of the poster example of the conflict between science and religion. Science is the process of doing experiments and closely making observations about how the world works, running experiments to see if we can prove certain theories, and coming to conclusions about what truth is based on our observation and experimentation. Religion, on the other hand, tends to be a belief system that's based on a received tradition, often received by way of revelation. God reveals something to human beings, and since God is perfect and inerrant, whatever God reveals to human beings must be true. And so for some fundamentalist religious people, if you have a fervently held belief that's based on your religious faith or revealed tradition, and science comes along and says something different, then science must be wrong, and your religion is correct. Whereas in the modern world and the Enlightenment world, right, if science establishes that something is true, then we need to rethink our religious beliefs in accordance with what science says. And that's sort of the classic conflict. That'll be one of the things we're going to look at in this first chapter of Genesis this morning. So what we're going to look at particularly this morning are the first 2 chapters of Genesis, or first 3 chapters, which I will argue are 2 separate stories about how the world was created, recorded in our Bible. The first one seems to relate to science. The second one seems to relate to questions of morality. So without further ado, I'm going to share the screen here. What's in the handout is first of all, this, which is the Jewish Study Bible. If you're looking to read a 1-volume modern English translation and commentary on the Bible from a Jewish perspective, this is the book to get. It's the Jewish Study Bible. It's published by Oxford University, and it includes the latest in sort of modern Jewish scholarship on who wrote the Bible, what it meant during its time period, what the context was, what words mean, and so on, from a modern scientific, historical, critical perspective. There's really only one book like it, the Oxford Jewish Study Bible. So what I included in our handouts were the first 3 chapters of Genesis with the commentary at the bottom and on the sides, and so that's what that is. I'm not going to read that now because it would take us too long to read through the story. So what I'm going to do is summarize this opening part We're pretty familiar, hopefully most of us are familiar with the story of creation. There are 6 days of creation. God rests on the 7th day. And I'll just read the opening lines here because the new translation changes the wording a little bit. Many people are familiar with, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That assumes a certain translation of this word here, bereshit, to mean in the beginning. Modern Hebrew scholars say maybe that's not what it means, and it could better be translated into English as when God began to create the heavens and the earth. What's the difference? In the beginning assumes that there was a beginning, whereas when God began to create doesn't say what happened before God began to create. Maybe there was something before God began to create, but when he decided to start creating the world, this is what happened. Okay, so he creates the heavens and the earth being unformed and void, darkness over the deep, and a wind from God sweeping over the surface of the water. God said, "Let there be light." I'm going to come back to this a little bit later. What was that light that was created at the very beginning? And there was light. God saw the light was good. God separated the light from darkness. He called the light day and darkness night, and there was evening and morning the first day. God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the water, that it may separate water from water." This is perhaps the most confusing sentence in the entire creation story. What does it mean when it says God separated water from water? God made the expanse. That's another crazy word. It's translating a difficult word in Hebrew also, rakia. We're not sure what rakia means here, so they're translating it as expanse. Let's call it plexiglass. He created a plexiglass sheet, and it separated the water which was below the expanse from the water which was above the expanse, and it was so. And God called the expanse sky, and there was evening and there was morning a second day. So at this point, I'm going to switch to my my visual depiction of the six days of creation here. So there is day 1. He creates light and separates light from dark. Day 2, he creates an expanse and separates the sky from the water. Day 3 is going to create land and gather the waters together to make seas. There's the blue part, and then the land over here. And on the land, he's going to create vegetables, fruits and plants and trees. And they're going to be planted on the land. That's the 3rd day. On the 4th day, God creates the sun, moon, and stars. And on the 5th day, he creates birds and fish. And on the 6th day, he creates animals that live on land and Homer Simpson, representing humanity. Right, human beings are at the end. And then God rests on the 7th day. So that is that's the story of creation as it appears in Genesis. Now let's take a look at some questions here. This is the other thing in my handout. That one of the first things in my handout is the summary of what I'm going to talk about today. I hope to provide this kind of an outline for you every week so that if you haven't been taking notes, you don't have to worry about it. The notes are already here for you. So how old is the world? The Bible seems to say that the world is 5,780 years old. At least that's the Jewish way of counting. That's based on the idea that that if you read all the begats in the book of Genesis, right? Adam and Eve begat Cain and Abel, and then later Seth. And those people begat other people and so on. So if you read all the begats and how old they were when they begat and how long they lived, and you back up the age of the universe to a time when we know, the Bible's history goes through, for instance, the destruction of the first temple, and we can date that because we know from Babylonian sources when that was. So then you just have to back up the story to the beginning, and that's how the Jewish calendar came to the conclusion that the world is 5,780 years old. And until the modern world, that's pretty much what people thought. Now we know that the world is billions of years old. Right? The universe is billions of years old, And our solar system is billions of years old, and our planet is billions of years old. So how do we reconcile that with 5,780 years? So some people say, well, that's easy, Rabbi, no problem. Um, as I just pointed out, God created the sun, moon, and stars on day 4, right? And the way we count days is by sunrise to sunset to sunrise again. And so if you take out the first 3 days, there was no sun, so we don't know we couldn't count 24 hours. So clearly those first 3 days at least were not 24-hour periods. They could easily be billions of years, and now we're fine. We've reconciled science with religion because the first 3 days were really billions of years long. That's nice, except for a couple of problems. First of all, as I said, God created the sun, moon, and star on day 4. When did God create plants? Day 3. And as we learn in elementary school, plants live on a process called photosynthesis, by which they take the sunlight and convert it into energy. So if plants are created on day 3, but the sun is not created till day 4, how did the plants live for the first 3 days? Now you might say, Rabbi, that's no problem, because remember, God created light on the first day. The primordial light that he created, that's what the plants were living on for the first 3 days. Okay, except now we have a bigger problem, because again, astronomers would tell you that the first thing created in our solar system was the sun, right? The sun was this swirling mass of energy, and around that swirling mass of energy eventually formed planets like the Earth. And so if the story of creation wanted to be really scientific, it would say on day 1, God created the sun, and only later would the earth come into existence with the sky, the heavens, the earth, and water, and all that. But that's not how it goes. The sun isn't created till day 4. So there are some problems. Now, I am not here to upset anybody's fervently held beliefs. If you still want to try and reconcile the 6 days of creation with science, you can. There's one physicist named Schroeder. I think his name is Schroeder. You can probably find him on Amazon.com and find his books about how he tries to reconcile physics with the story of creation. And there are probably very clever ways of doing that. I'm going to suggest a more simple solution to the problem. But there is, I just wanted to point out at first, a problem with it. So let me go back to my outline here. Okay, so let's start with the story of separating water above from water below, and I'll take a look again at my picture here. If you didn't catch it before, here's the expanse. So day 2, he creates an expanse, which I said was like a sheet of clear plexiglass. And he uses that to separate the water above from the water below. And I think to understand that, you have to take a look at this picture here and imagine that you lived 3,000 years ago, before we sent a man to the moon, and before we had telescopes and so on. If you were an ancient person and you looked up at the sky and you saw that the sky was blue, and you're looking out at the ocean below and you're seeing that the ocean is blue, and not only that, but you know that it rains, that therefore there's water up there that comes down, you would say to yourself, gee, the ocean is blue and it's full of water. The sky is blue and water comes from up there. That blue must also be a big pool of water. There's a huge pool of water up there. But then you would ask yourself, why doesn't that water just come crashing down on our heads? And the answer given in the second day of creation is that God created a sheet of plexiglass, or a clear dome of some kind, a protective clear dome, and he lifted half of the primordial water up and suspended it over this canopy of plexiglass. And that's what prevents that water from all coming crashing down on our heads. And how do we know that? What is the proof, the scientific proof for it in the ancient world? It rains. And how does it rain? because this plexiglass sheet that's holding the water up has windows in it. And when God wants it to rain, the windows of the heavens open up and the water falls down. And that is precisely how it's described when the story of the flood is described in the part about Noah and the flood. Right? So in the story of Noah and the flood, it says that the windows of the heavens opened and the water came down. So that's clearly what ancient people thought, or at least I believe that's clearly what ancient people thought, that there was a big pool of water up there, and that's why the sky is blue. It's prevented from falling on our heads because of God's plexiglass that he created on day 2, but there are windows in it that allow the rain to fall through. Now, again, that's not science, right? We've sent a man to the moon. We've sent rockets out into outer space. There's no pool of water up there. Not only that, we now know the laws of physics of sunlight and how light is refracted through the atmosphere, and that creates rainbows, and it also creates the blueness of the sky. So we can explain the blueness of the sky without sort of our ancient thinking about it being a pool of water. We know better now, but people back then didn't. Okay, now the next thing I want to point out is that although this is bad science, I would say, it's not science how we would understand science, it is actually a scientific explanation of creation. So I organized the chart in this particular way to show you how highly structured creation is described in this first chapter of Genesis. First, God turns on the lights, right? That would be the first thing you're doing if you're going to open your workshop. You turn on the lights so you can see what you're doing. And then the entire process of creation after that is about making separations and distinctions. Separating the light from the dark. Separating water above from water below. It's all a process of imposing order on a chaotic world, on a chaotic universe. The world is black in chaos, and then God turns on a light and he separates light from darkness. There's this big primordial chaotic water, and he makes a distinction between water above and water below. He then gathers the water below into clumps so that dry land can appear, and he plants plants on that land. And although I didn't read the description, if you go back and read it, each plant reproduces its own kind. It's very specific to say that. You don't get tomatoes from carrot plants. You don't get apples from orange trees. Each produce is highly specific and reproduces its own kind. Again, a very precise separation, distinction, and imposing structure and order on what was chaotic. Each thing has its own purpose and own space, its own context. Okay? So that's the first 3 days. The second 3 days continue that. Now you have the sun, moon, and stars, and it doesn't just say that God created the sun, moon, and stars, but it tells you that the sun helps us keep track of time by day, right? So we can distinguish day and night. And the moon helps us distinguish time by the months. Months originally were based on the lunar cycle. That's how they got to be called months. They come from moon, month. And so the lunar cycle helps us to keep track of the days of the month. And the stars help us to keep track of the seasons. As any astronomer would know, certain constellations appear in the springtime versus summertime. You can tell what time it is. And if you're a seafaring person, you can also tell directions and so on from the stars. They are highly, in other words, the Bible once again is telling us that this system of sun, moon, and stars is highly structured, very purposeful, imposing an order on the chaos of time and space and creation, right? The sun, moon, and stars help us to make all kinds of distinctions because creation, the process of creation, is about making distinctions. And then God creates birds and fish, and each kind, again, reproduces its own type, the Bible says. So we have very distinct kinds of birds that fly in the air and kinds of fish and other water life that live in the sea. And then the same thing happens with animals that live on land. And you will notice that the Bible creates again, a distinction of three kinds of animals. Animals that live in the air, animals that live in the water, and animals that live on land. And that's very purposeful. Every time in the Bible, when it talks about the animal life on the planet, it divides the animal kingdom up into these three categories. So it's making distinctions: animals that live in air, animals that live in the water, and animals that live on land. And finally, human beings are created. Homer Simpson's not maybe our best mascot, but it creates human beings as the crowning creature of creation. Okay, now there's one other thing I want to point out. In the left column, you have the first 3 days are things that are created that don't move. This primordial light doesn't move. It just goes on and off. It's night or day. Doesn't move. The water above and the water below doesn't move. It just is. It's two spaces, two areas, planes of existence, let's say. Again, land and water don't move. I mean, look, the water, the oceans, there's waves and so on, but essentially the water is contained in its space, the land is contained in its space, not moving. The plants also sway in the breeze, but essentially they're planted in the ground. They don't walk and move around. They're static. So in the left column, you have static items, things that don't move. On the right column are things that move. So instead of primordial light that's static and doesn't move, you've got sun, moon, and stars that move all the time. Instead of the non-moving water and sky, you have the birds and the fish that move in the water and the sky. And instead of the land that doesn't move and the plants, you now have animals that move on the land. So what my point is, whoever thought of this brilliant idea of creation, the point of it was to tell us that creation is highly, highly structured and organized, that it was a process of God imposing order on what was a chaotic primordial soup. Remember, at the beginning, in the beginning, the world was tohu vavohu. It was this chaotic mess. And God's now imposing order on the mess so that it's highly structured and systematic and functions according to specific rules that we can rely on to tell time, to tell the months, to tell the seasons. And if we plant carrots, we're going to get carrots. We're not going to get tomatoes. And if we want bunny rabbits, we can raise bunny rabbits. They won't turn into cats, right? So everything is highly structured. That's the story of creation that's told in the first chapter of Genesis. It's not science as we understand it, but it's what I would say an attempt at science. And one only has to look at other creation stories that other civilizations came up with to realize how unique this story is. Most creation stories start with many gods who are fighting with each other, who, as a result of their arguments and fights, the world is haphazardly created, and they create a haphazard world that people need to enlist one of the gods to save them, to defend them against the whims of the other gods. And it's a big mess. And our story is that's completely wrong. There are not many gods. There's one creator God who had a plan and a structure and a system and wanted to impose order on chaos. And the system is so highly structured and ordered that if you study it, you can understand how it works. So although it's not science the way we would understand it, it's science the way it could have been understood by somebody living 3,000 years ago, and it provides the opportunity for understanding science, even if it's not science as we would understand it today, because it tells us that there is a structure and meaning and order in the universe, because there's a unified creator who created the world in a unified way. So so that's the first thing I would point out over there. And oh, yeah. So now I want to come back to, so we talked about the water above and the water below. So what was this primordial light? So, so some people, I think the physicists who tried to reconcile the first chapter of Genesis with science, said that this first light that was created on day one was the Big Bang, because that is what science says happened first. The, there was a Big Bang, and from that the universe expanded, etc. And so that primordial light was the Big Bang. You can say that, I suppose. I just don't think our ancestors were aware of the Big Bang. So I had a different thought, and it occurred to me one day when I was looking at the water, during sunset. And you watch the sun go down below the horizon, and you look up at the sky, and it's still light outside. And if you're an ancient person and you notice that the sun's gone and it's still light outside, you might ask yourself, why is it still light outside? The sun's not in the sky. And you would ask yourself the same question in the morning before the sun rises. If you're up before sunrise, it's already light in the sky before the sun rises. How can it be light in the sky if there's no sun up there? So I think, and I haven't seen any Bible scholar say this, so it's just me talking right now. I think that when it says that God created light on the first day and separated light from darkness and called it night and day, that our ancestors thought there was some other light out there, some primordial light that caused the sky to light up and that made it, and that went out at night to make it dark. And that the sun was just an extra light that's extra bright as it travels through the sky. But what makes the sky light up is something else, and that was something else was created on day one. In any case, you can see it's not a bad effort to try and describe creation. So now I want to do a thought experiment. If you were God, how would you have explained creation the way we now understand creation happened scientifically? How would you explain that to a human being who lived 3,000 years ago? Right? If you tried to tell that human being that the earth is not the center of the universe, that person would probably say, you're crazy. I can see that the sun circles around the earth because it comes up every morning in the east and it sets in the west, and it obviously travels underground at night and comes back up in the east again. How else would that happen? And if you tried to tell that person, no, the earth is actually turning, that person would say to you, that's crazy. I don't feel like I'm moving. I'm standing still. And the earth is standing still. I would feel it if the earth was moving, right? And if you tried to tell that person, there's no bag of water up there, it's just the sky and there's refraction of sunlight, they'd say, what's refraction? And if you tried to tell the person that their stars are billions of light years away, they'd say, what's a light year? I mean, they would have no way of knowing. And then you're going to try and explain to them how life started with single-celled organisms for people who never seen a microscope. What's a cell? It just would not make any sense to people 3,000 years ago. So even if you were God, trying to tell a human being how this all worked to somebody 3,000 years ago, they wouldn't get it. But what they could get is that the universe is structured and organized and runs according to principles that are understandable if we study them. And that is basically what the first chapter of Genesis does. So it's not science the way we understand it, but it allows there to be a scientific process, unlike stories of creation where there's chaotic gods fighting with each other, right? So that's my first argument about that. So let's see. Okay, so that's the first one. Now let's, any questions about that so far? We'll take a look at the second story. Okay, so now we're going to have a second story, which I'm going to argue is very different. Maybe we'll take a look at the at what it says in the Bible again, just briefly. All right, so God creates the heavens and the earth. By the way, over here you see chapter 2 of Genesis. the heavens and the earth were finished, and on the seventh day God rested. So the chapter numbers were not decided by Jewish people. The chapter numbers were inserted by Christian scholars who wanted to be able to refer to chapters and verses when they were citing them to prove certain things in the New Testament. And so they wanted to be able to direct people to the precise sentence that they wanted to look at. So they inserted chapters and verse numbers. I only say that because we would not have put chapter 2 here. The Jewish view is that the Sabbath, which is what's described here, is part of that creation story, right? 6 days of creation and God rested on the seventh. Resting on the seventh is part of creation. So we wouldn't have inserted a chapter break here. But in any case, there it is. Here's where we would have broken the section up, and here is where the second story of creation begins. How do you know? Because the creation stories are bracketed by opening and closing sentences. Let's go back to the first sentence. When God began to create the heavens and the earth being unformed and void and darkness over the face of the earth, right? And then it ends with, and there was even, it ends with, such is the story of heaven and earth when they were created. By the way, here, heaven comes first, and up here, heaven comes first, right? So that is the beginning sentence of the creation story. And here is the ending sentence of the creation story. Here. And now look what happens. When the Lord made the earth and heaven, switching the order of the two, right? It was heaven and earth. Now it's earth and heaven. That's the first clue that this is a separate story. It's reversed the two realms, the earth and the heavens. When the Lord made the earth and heaven, when no shrub of the field was yet on the earth, and no grasses of the field had yet sprouted, right? So before day 3 in the first version, because the Lord had not yet sent rain on the earth, and there was no one to till the soil, the Lord formed man from the dust of the earth and blew into his nostrils a breath of life, and the man became a living being. And the Lord planted a garden in Eden. Now there's plants, and placed the man that he formed. And from the ground the Lord caused to grow every tree that was pleasing and for food and so on. The order of creation is different. Not only is earth the first thing mentioned, but human beings are the first things created out of dirt. And then plants are created. In the first story, plants are day 3, humans are day 6. Here, humans are first and then plants. A river issues from Eden to water the garden, etc., etc. And the Lord commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden you are to eat, but the tree of knowledge of good and bad you can't eat, for as soon as you eat it, you will die. And the Lord said, it is not good for a human being to be alone. By the way, the word for man here is Adam in Hebrew. And Adam also comes from Adamah, which means earth, because man was created from earth. So Adamah is earth, Adam is man, and a very clever Bible translator therefore called this primordial man not Adam, but earthling, which I think is very clever, earthling. So it's not good for the earthling to be alone. I will make for him a fitting helper. And the Lord formed out of the earth all the wild beasts and the birds of the sky and brought them to see them, what he would call them. And whatever the man called a creature, that would be its name. So here, creatures are created after human beings. In the first story of creation, human beings were the last to be created. And the man gave names to all the cattle and the birds of the sky and all the wild beasts, but there was still no fitting helper. So God cast a deep sleep upon this earthling, and while he slept, he took one of his ribs, and the Lord fashioned from the rib that he had taken from the man a woman, and he brought her to the man. And the man said, this one at last is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for from man she was taken. Hence a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, so they become one flesh. So This is, first of all, a beautiful and poetic description of the creation of human beings. Um, I'm trying to make it gender neutral. There is actually a traditional commentary that suggests that the Adam was not a male, that Adam was actually androgynous. He was both male and female, and that he sort of had a male half and a female half. And when God put him to sleep, he took out one half and created a separate creature. So now they're distinct, a male and a female creature, right? And so originally androgynous. And of course, in a modern sense, where we are, we live in an egalitarian world, and I would say, thank God, men and women are at least ideally thought of as being equal, even if our society is not fully there yet. But we are both human beings of equal value and stature and should be treated as such. And so it's helpful not to think of the first creature as being male and that the help me or the helper was the female. I'm going to get back to that in a little bit later, but that they're actually co-equal partners. Daniel, you had a question.
I don't have it in front of me here, but the sentence at the very end of what you just read starts with hence, and it basically says people. Uh, let's pull it up. Good. Leave his mother and father. No, you had it. Go back down. Right there.
Hence, a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife.
What? Right. The key word there to me that is confusing is the word hence. I think of hence as meaning therefore or because of, and
Yeah,
it's almost saying. Well, tell me what you think it's saying. I won't.
yeah. So that's a good question. So yeah, I think this what this. So this is really important. He began by saying it is not good for the human, the earthling, to be alone. And this is many of these stories. If you were an anthropologist, we're not a religious person reading this as a sacred text, but you're an anthropologist studying culture. You would say that these kind of stories are, I forgot the technical term for it offhand, but they're origin stories, etiological stories. That's what they're called. Etiological, E-T-I-O-L, etiological. That is their origin stories. They explain the origin of something that we see in the world. And one of the things that this very perceptive writer noticed was human beings are social creatures. And boy, do we feel that now during this period when we're all isolated and separated in our homes. We are social creatures. It is not good for us, literally not good for us to be alone. We crave companionship. And that was recognized by this early author as a fundamental aspect of what it means to be a human being. It's difficult for a human being to live a life of loneliness. You need a partner. So what he does, in essence, is he creates a partner by separating the creature into two parts. And so here, the hence, what it means is you are, when you're born, seeking out that other half of you. You're seeking the other half of you. And when you find it, that's why you you cling to that other person, that partner, and you leave your parents, your family, and you cling to someone else. Again, this does explain a pretty common phenomenon in human nature that when we grow up, we leave home. And whoever we end up partnering with, they become more important in our lives. Even though our mother and father may be very dear to us, and we love them very much, nevertheless, we find allegiance with the person we're going to share a life with. And so that's what this is describing. Now, I want to add a couple thoughts to this. First of all, in the modern world, sometimes it's very difficult to find that partner. And then other times we have that partner, we go through most of life, and then they die, or some other thing happens, and we're not with the partner, and then we're alone again. And that's really hard. And so one way to help overcome that problem is to have very good friends, a close group of very good friends who can help you not feel alone. Because really, one of the hardest things in life is to live life alone, certainly without friends, and without a life partner. It's much easier to go through life with people who you can rely on and relate to and share intimate thoughts with, if not, a partner that you share sexual intimacy with. The other thing I want to say is that this phrase here, this sentence, has often been used by sort of fundamentalists to say that it's natural for a man to crave a woman and a woman to crave a partnership with a man, but not so of two people with the same gender. And therefore, same gender relationships should be forbidden because the Bible seems to suggest that here, right? A man leaves his mother and father and clings to his wife, not another man. And all I would say to that is that now, again, this was the understanding of our ancient ancestors who didn't understand biology and didn't understand that some people are hardwired not to be interested in people of the opposite gender that way. And so what do you do then? You're then saying to that person who is not interested in having that intimate relationship with someone of another gender, you're saying that person, you must be alone. You must live a life of loneliness because we're not going to allow you to have that intimate relationship with someone of the same gender. So here I would say you have a conflict. You have a conflict between two principles in the opening section here of Genesis. One is it's not good for a human being to be alone. And the other is, should you be cleaving to someone of the opposite gender? And the primary statement was, it's not good for a human being to be alone. And based on that, I think it's our understanding that certainly the conservative movement and the reform movement have understood that same-gender, intimate, monogamous relationships should be recognized because it's not good for human beings to be alone. We're fundamentally creatures that desire intimacy with another person. And
let me just throw this out, and I'll let you move on. It's so that they become one flesh. Hence, and so, it's almost saying that the purpose of life is to go back to being unisexual.
Not unisexual, but yeah. You know what? I mean, and this actually also deals with Kabbalistic mysticism as well. The union of two people together and forming intimacy is almost as if you're trying to be the same. Yes, you're trying to be the same.
I was hoping you would go there, Rabbi. Thank you.
But yeah, and they would say the same thing when you do that. It's symbolic of unifying God. And I'm only this much Kabbalist, so you have to ask Rabbi Horowitz for more on that. But the idea that you're trying to create a unification here that will also create a unification in the cosmos. Right.
Rabbi.
Yes.
I'm not sure if I missed it because I joined a little late, but are you going to have a moment to discuss, or maybe I just haven't read it correctly either, but in the two stories, where does the creation of man and the woman happen the same, or is it different? Like, does he put to sleep the man in both stories?
Right. Yeah. So yes, good question. So let's take a look at how that works in the first story. He creates both at the same time, it seems, right? Let's go back up to the end of, here we go. So actually let's read that part because I want to read that anyway. Let us make man in our image. This is like a really crucial statement in Judaism that human beings are created in the image of God. There's something about human beings that's fundamentally different from the other animals, and it's not about our physical nature. At least that's the way we now understand it. It's not that God looks like human beings with arms and legs and toes and hands and thumbs. It's that there's something fundamentally different about human beings from other animals, and that is our intellectual nature, our spiritual nature, and our moral nature. Our ability to make moral decisions to have free will, as we're going to see in the second story, and that we have something spiritual about us that's fundamentally different and intellectually different than animals. Animals have some aspects of that, but we are the epitome of this. We're the most godlike of the creatures on earth. So let us make man in our image, after our likeness. They'll rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle. Here's the three aspects of the animal kingdom, right? The water, the sky, and the land, and all the creeping things that creep on earth. And God created man in his image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. So he seems to have created them both at the same time. And God blessed them and said, be fertile and increase, fill the earth and master it. And by the way, the human race has indeed conquered the world. There's no question about it. And now, unfortunately, we need to be responsible for that. We need to make sure we can preserve life on this planet. As I'm going to say in a minute, that we're going to see that God's charging us with the responsibility to take care of the planet now. We're going to conquer it so that we can take care of it. We are the gardeners. We're the caretakers. We're the zookeepers, the shepherds. We're responsible. That's our job. So he says, be fertile and increase and fill the earth and master it. Rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and all the living things that creep on earth. And then God says, I give you every seed-bearing plant that is on the earth, and every tree that has every seed-bearing fruit. They shall be yours for food. Notice here, God is instructing human beings to be vegetarian. There's nothing here about eating animals. We're ruling over the animals, but we're eating trees, seed-bearing fruit, and trees and plants. We're vegetarians. And to all the animals on the land and all the birds of the sky and everything that creeps on earth in which there's a breath of life, I give plants for food. All animals in this ideal world were supposed to be vegetarians. And it was so, right? That when God kicks Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden, he repeats the idea that we're vegetarians. And it's not until the story of Noah that God says to, when Noah gets off the boat after the flood, he says, okay, now you can eat animals. I mean, it's really specific. You can read that on your own, but just want to point that out too. So yes, so Adam and Eve were created at the same time before, and now they're. Yeah, I love my steak. Yeah, so that's okay. Since the time of Noah, you're allowed to eat meat, and I don't have time for this now. But when I talk about kashrut, the laws of kashrut. The laws of kashrut are all about limiting our diet of meat, right? If you're vegetarian, you're automatically kosher. So you can have your steak, and if you're Jewish, though, you have to have the steak according to the Jewish rules, which limit to some extent how you kill the animal, how you treat the meat, and so on, and that you have to separate meat from milk. Okay, so let's go back to our story here of the two. Okay, so he creates Adam and Eve, and he puts them in the garden. Oh, we got to, let's go back to reading the story here. So God tells them not to eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And let's see, where does he say this? Okay. So he creates the woman, right? So he created the woman after he told him not to eat the tree of knowledge. So Eve didn't necessarily hear this, although if you think Eve was part of Adam at the time, I guess she did hear it. But in any case, they're not supposed to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So now he's created Eve, and the two cleave together as one flesh. Now the two of them were naked, the man and his wife, yet they felt no shame. Now the serpent was the shrewdest of all the wild beasts that the Lord had made, and said to the woman, did God really say, don't eat of the tree? And the woman said, well, if we can't eat it, we may eat the fruit of any other tree. It's only the fruit of this tree that we can't eat, and we can't even touch it lest we die. And the serpent said, you're not going to die, but God knows that as soon as you eat it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like divine beings, who know good and bad. And when the woman saw that the tree was good and good for eating and delight to the eyes, and the tree was desirable as a source of wisdom, she took its fruit and ate it. And then she gave some to her husband, and he ate it. And then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were naked. So they made fig leaves to cover themselves. And then they heard God roaming around in the garden. And God said, "Where are you?" Of course, God knows where they are. That was a rhetorical question. "Where are you?" And Adam replied, "I heard the sound of you in the garden. I was afraid because I'm naked, so I hid." And God said, "Who told you you were naked? Did you eat of the tree from which I had forbidden you to eat?" And the man said, "The woman, the one that you put at my side, she gave me the fruit and I ate it." And then God said to the woman, "What is this that you have done?" And the woman replied, "The serpent duped me and I ate it." And this is classic. Any parent who's had kids knows that this is how children behave, right? They get caught with their hands in the cookie jar and not my fault. He did it, right? It's somebody else, right? She made me do it. And then she says, the snake made me do it. This is just normal behavior. Remember that Adam and Eve are probably kids, if not literally children. They are, only a few days old, so they're acting like children. Not a surprise. So then God goes about saying, well, the snake is going to have to crawl on its belly. And then this is, again, an etiological statement, right? Why, trying to explain why snakes move in such an unusual way that they slither on the ground. Isn't that weird? How come every other animal seems to have feet? And so this story is trying to explain why serpents don't have feet by saying that originally the snake did have feet, little spindly legs, and he walked upright. But then he did this thing, so God took his feet away, and now he has to slither around on the ground. And then he turns to the woman and he says, "I will make most severe your pangs in childbearing. In pain you'll bear children, but your urge will be for your husband, and he will rule over you." I'm going to come back to that because that's an importantly misunderstood statement also. And then he says to Adam, "Because you did as your wife said and ate of the tree about which I commanded you, shall not eat it. Cursed be the ground because of you. By toil shall you eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it will sprout for you. But your food will be the grasses of the field. And by the sweat of your brow you will get bread to eat until you return to the ground. For
Rabbi?
from it you were
Oh,
taken, and for dust you are, and to dust you shall return."
Rabbi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Of all the stories in the Torah, this one bothers me the most.
Yeah,
I will tell you why.
sure.
If God is all-knowing, then God knew that Eve was going to eat from the tree of good and evil.
Yes.
It was foreordained.
Yes.
What is the purpose of punishing Adam and Eve? And what was the purpose of having a tree that was forbidden?
Right. Right. So that's exactly the crux of the story. Right? And of course, there's a lot of ways to understand it. So, and you can read a lot of other commentaries. To me, it seems obvious that God actually wanted us to eat the fruit.
Yeah.
Yes. Because for a number of reasons. First of all, God is all knowing, right? God's not stupid. And it's a classic case of, let's say, I'll be a little bit gender unobjective, I guess, and say a woman is baking cookies. Mother bakes cookies and they smell really nice, and she puts them in the cookie jar, and then she leaves them on the kitchen counter, and then she says to her 5-year-old child, "I'm going shopping. Don't touch the cookies in the cookie jar." And what did you expect was going to happen? Right? Of course, the cookies are overpowering in their smell and too delightful to the eyes. And every child knows how wonderful it is to eat cookies. And if nobody's watching, the child's going to eat the cookies, right?
Then why was the serpent punished?
Yeah. So So again, I read the story in a number of ways. One of them, again, is the way an anthropologist would read it. It's trying to explain certain things that we already know. We know that a serpent crawls on its belly, so it's trying to explain that. Um, we know that life is difficult, that if you want food, you have to till the soil, yeah, and before the modern age anyway. And that was done with a stick, right? And not with a big plow. You had a stick that you dragged across the ground to furrow it, and then you had to plant the seeds by hand. You had to water them by hand. You had to weed the garden. You had to, harvest the crops. You had to thresh the grain, grind the grain to make flour, then knead it into dough and bake it, and so on. It was an arduous process to make bread until the modern world. Why should it be so difficult, right? So why is it difficult? Well, because we made this mistake back then. It's trying to explain that. And the other thing that seems terribly unfair is, why is it that women suffer so much pain when they're having children? And the other animals don't seem to have that problem. So why do human women have this difficulty? And in order to explain it, they tell the story. So on one level, it's an etiological story trying to explain things we already know exist. But on another level, I would say it's actually teaching us the most important lesson of all, which is that human beings have free will. That was really the point of putting the tree in the garden, in my opinion, because God wanted to see if we could do something that we weren't programmed to do. So imagine your other animals. Other animals seem to know what is food and what is not food instinctively. They don't try to chew on rocks. And if they know something is poison, they will try to avoid it. So that's why we have to disguise poison to look and smell and taste like food so that they'll eat it if we want to kill them. But normally they would avoid things that are poisonous to them. So here, God is basically saying to the creature, the human being, don't eat this fruit because it's poison, right? So instinct would tell this creature not to eat it. And yet that's exactly what we do. Why? Well, because we have free will. We can't be so easily programmed. We don't operate strictly by instinct, although instinct is part of what we do, but we can make choices in life. Every single day, every minute, we can make a choice about what we want to do. And for some reason, God wanted to create a creature that had free will. Now, I'm going to explain why in a minute, but I think that was essential to God's creation of the universe, to create a creature that could make free will choices about what we wanted to do with our lives. So why would God do that? Okay, now I'm going to tell you, this is the unorthodox part. This is just the Steve Morgen part. And again, I haven't seen anybody else say this. One day I'm going to write an article about it, and we'll get it peer reviewed, and everybody will critique it. But here's my thought. The first chapter of Genesis, which is very different, as I explained, the sequence of events is different, the style of writing is different. It seems to be a very different story. And modern Bible scholars say they were two different stories written at two different times by two different people and then stuck together. Okay? And that I'll talk about not next week, but the week after next, how that happened. But take it for now that it's two different stories. The first story is necessary for science because it says the world operates according to scientific principles and rules. It's highly structured, and if you study it, you can understand it. But the problem with a scientific world that's highly structured is it's not fair. It's not just. Bad things are going to happen to good people simply because they just happen. The laws of physics will happen whether you're a good person or not. If you're on a dangerous mountain road and the ice is slippery and you fall off, gravity's going to pull you down and you'll probably die, whether you're a good person or not. It's not fair, but it happens because gravity is gravity, and that's part of the system. It's also not kind and compassionate. There's going to be times when people are going to suffer. And who's going to take care of those suffering people? According to laws of physics, there's not much you can do. But, God says to God's self, if I can create, okay, so wait, let me, so God, you answer that with, say God can interfere with the laws of physics, right? God just will scoop the person up out of the air while they're falling down and put them back on the road and interfere with the laws of physics, no problem. The problem with that is that that puts God in a very difficult position, for one thing. How does God decide when to save somebody from disaster? Like, it's Mother Teresa falling off the cliff, so I got to save Mother Teresa. She's an angel, you know. She's an amazing person. I have to save her. I'm going to rescue her. I'm going to put her back up on the road. The next person who falls off the cliff, you have to make a calculation. Is this person as good as Mother Teresa? Not quite so good. Should I rescue? Should I not rescue? Is it, you know, and how do you decide who to save and who not to save and what to, I mean, and not only that, once you start saving a bunch of people, you're violating the laws of physics on a regular basis. You don't have laws of physics anymore. And then you can't understand the world because the world is in fact chaotic and you do have to depend on the gods to save you. So the first chapter of Genesis says God created a world that operates under laws of physics. And that's just how it is. And it's not fair and it's not kind, but it is. And 99% of the time, 99.9% of the time, the world is magnificent and supports all kinds of life and creates beauty and all kinds of wonderful things in the world. Almost all the time, it's magnificent. There's some problems. How do you fix those problems? So God says to God's self, if I can create a creature that can think for itself, that can make moral choices, and has opposable thumbs, very important for human beings. This allowed us to manipulate the world really well, right? If I can create this creature who can start to think and figure things out, this creature, when it does the right things, can help alleviate the suffering in the world and can make it more fair and just and more kind and compassionate by taking care of those people who are suffering, by providing justice when people screw up, and we'll make the world a more just and fair world. We'll be honest in business dealings and so on. I just need to create this creature who has free will so that it can think for itself. And then because the creature lives in the physical world, whatever that creature does doesn't violate the laws of physics. But when it behaves appropriately, it can solve some of the problems that the laws of physics necessarily creates. And so the second chapter of Genesis comes to tell you that this creature has free will. That was the purpose of the exercise. I'm going to teach this creature that this is poison and then see if the creature eats it anyway. And when it does, it will realize the difference between good and bad because it knows that the creature has free will to choose what it wants to do in life. And that's what I need this creature to do because now I can train this creature to be good and to help solve the problems of creation. And the whole rest of the Bible depends on these two chapters of Genesis. One, that the world operates according to natural rules, but number two, and most importantly, human beings have free will. And if we can train that creature to be good, we can solve a lot of problems in the world. The rest of the Bible is mostly about human beings screwing up and not being good and not doing the right thing, and God trying to continually teach and direct and guide human beings to be better so that they can fix the world. But it doesn't make any sense unless you believe that human beings have free will, right? All the rest of the things that happen in the stories are about being wrong, getting punished, trying to be corrected to do right, and so on. None of that makes any sense if human beings are only instinctive creatures. And so we need both of these stories. I want to end with one last thing that's very important to mention about the woman being subservient to the husband.
Yeah.
Again, a very misunderstood passage of the Bible, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many of my teachers. Okay, so we've created this world, and everybody gets punished. The snake is crawling on its belly, and by the sweat of your brow you have bread to eat. That's what he says to the man. And the woman has to suffer in childbearing, and she is going to be subservient to her husband. The punishment for the man was that he was going to have to work really, really hard in order to get a loaf of bread. In the 21st century, well, of course, now we have coronavirus. It's not so easy to get bread anymore. But even so, even with coronavirus, you can still get bread relatively easily. You can hire somebody to buy it for you in a store and deliver it to your home, or wear a mask, go to the store, get a loaf of bread. It's really not that hard. And even if it costs $5 instead of $3, that's less than 1 hour's work, right? The minimum wage. So to get a loaf of bread today is pretty darn easy. It's not like it was 3,000 years ago where you had to do all that work to get a loaf of bread. The guy who plows the field sits in an air-conditioned cabin in a combine that's plowing the field. He's listening to his favorite tunes on his iPhone. He's not working that hard, right? Not by the sweat of his brow. It's air-conditioned. And threshing and grinding the grain, all that's done by machinery. You push a button, it happens. We have eliminated the suffering of man in creating food by modern technology. We have invented painkillers that we can give women in childbearing so that they don't have to suffer now in childbearing either. By the way, the reason for that, again, our ancestors didn't know this, but because of evolution and the evolution of the human brain, the brain became bigger, so the brain case had to become bigger, and that made our skulls too big, and unfortunately the pelvic bone of the female has not adjusted yet to the size of the brain, the skull. So give it a few million years, that'll be solved. But in the meantime, we have painkillers. But that's the reason for pain in childbearing, and now we know that scientifically. It's not because of what it says in chapter 3 of Genesis. But in any case, we've solved that problem. We have painkillers. Why on earth would we continue to maintain this last punishment of Eve, women, that they should be subservient to their husbands, when we know better? We know that human beings were created equal. That's certainly what it says in the first chapter of Genesis. Every human being is created in God's image. We're equal co-partners. And even in the second story of creation, God says, I'm going to create an Ezer Kenegdo. And Ezer Kenegdo is the Hebrew word for a helping partner, a counterpart. But Ezer doesn't have to mean a subservient helper, and Keneged indicates an equal partner. The Hebrew word Keneged means an equal counterpart. So they help each other. They're co-equal partners. There's no reason for there to be one subservient to the other. And so I just would like to dispel that this misinformation. Okay, with that, I am open to questions. Isn't that a small hint of original sin? Yes. So in regards to original sin, there's an extra article in the handout that deals with the question of original sin. We don't have that concept of original sin. The idea, I mean, you could say it was the first time human beings made a mistake. So original in the sense of first time, but not in the sense that it has any consequence for human beings later, except for the fact that we don't live in paradise, right? God kicks Adam and Eve out of paradise, and now we live in the real world where we have to work to earn our living, and we have to find ways to negotiate in the world. So that's all true, but it doesn't have any cosmic significance for us that we're damned if we don't do some things or whatever. The Jewish view is that human beings, babies, are born innocent. They haven't done anything wrong because they don't know any better. And so so there's no or sense of original sin in that sense. And there's an article attached that describes that. We are using this Zoom room for Aaron Howard. Can you wrap it up in 5 minutes? Yes. So I will definitely do that. How irresponsible are Adams run from his own
Rabbi,
mistake? Yes. Question?
um, I'm, I'm very intrigued about um, this. Like, I put everything in motion. It's done. Yes, I know there's. I mean, there's obviously we have to, the laws of nature and all that. But why there's verses in scripture that command us to pray, like pray for the peace of Jerusalem.
Right.
If prayer, if does it call on Hashem to intervene, then we pray.
Ah, right. So that question about what prayer will affect or not affect, I'll deal with a little bit when I talk about why bad things happen to good people. So that'll be later in the class. I'll address that question later. I have to get a wrap up over here. So if you have more questions, please feel free to email me or send me text messages in Facebook or something like that, and I'm happy to answer them. I hope everybody enjoyed this first class. We talked about the two important things about science and morality and the stories of creation. There's 2 extra questions at the end. Take a look at those questions and think about them, and stay tuned next week for more exciting adventures. Thanks for joining us.